You are standing outside an old broken house near Rome. It is early morning on June 9th, 68 AD. The light is weak, and everything feels cold and quiet. From behind a broken wooden door you hear a man crying. He's the most powerful man in the world. A man who once led huge armies, who burned cities just for fun, and even killed his own mother. Now he is crying like a scared little boy. His voice used to be strong enough to fill theatres with music, but now it is shaking and weak as he keeps saying the same thing over and over. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. This is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the 5th emperor of Rome, living his final hours. This is the same man who kicked his pregnant wife to death, the man who cut a young boy and made him dress like a woman to replace her, the man who watched Rome burn while writing poems. Now he is not dying in a war or with his guards around him. He's hiding in a poor man's house, too scared to even kill himself. But to understand how the most powerful man on earth ended up like this, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the palace, where a young boy first learned to kill. Before we start this story about survival and pain, if you enjoy learning the real truth about history, please like this video and subscribe for more. Also comment below and tell me where you are watching from. It is amazing how people from all over the world can learn about the past together. December 15th, 37 AD. A baby is born in a town near the sea called Antium. The first light of the day touched his skin. Later, people said this showed how dangerous he would be. His full name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. From the moment he was born, his family history was full of killing and cruelty. His great-great-grandfather rode through Gaul on an elephant, showing off the heads of people he had killed. His grandfather took out a Roman knight's eye in public for talking back to him. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was so mean that when someone said "Congratulations on your baby," he replied, "Nothing good can come from me and Agrippina." Those words turned out to be true. The baby's mother, Agrippina the Younger, was one of the most dangerous women in Rome. She was the sister of Emperor Caligula and the great-granddaughter of Augustus. She had royal blood and a strong will to get power. She had already been kicked out of Rome once for plotting against her brother. She had also already lost one husband in a strange way. Now she was planning to put her son on the throne. When Lucius was only 3 years old, his father died. Some said he was poisoned, others said he had a sickness. The boy got 1/3 of his father's money. But even that was taken away when Caligula, who was emperor at the time, took all their property. Agrippina was sent to live alone on a faraway island. Her son was left in the care of his aunt Lepta with just 2 servants, a dancer and a barber. Not the kind of people who raise future emperors, but Agrippina was not the type to give up. When Caligula was murdered in 41 AD and her uncle Claudius became emperor, she found her way back into power. First she married Gaius Sallustius Passienus, one of the richest men in Rome. He died shortly after, and she got all his money. Then she aimed higher. Claudius already had a wife named Messalina. She was known all over Rome for her wild behaviour. But Messalina made a huge mistake. She married her lover while still being married to the emperor. Whether she was drunk or trying to take over the empire, no one knows, but it gave Agrippina the chance she needed. Messalina was killed, and Agrippina stepped in. Just imagine it. Emperor Claudius, a slow and sick man in his 60s, completely in love with his young and pretty niece. Normally, Roman law did not allow uncles and nieces to marry, but when you are emperor, rules do not matter. In 49 AD, Lucius was 12 years old when he saw his mother become empress. That marriage set him on the path to power. Agrippina did not waste time. She convinced Emperor Claudius to adopt her son, and the boy's name was changed to Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. When Nero turned 13, he was given the official title of manhood. At 14, he was named the next emperor, taking the place of Claudius's own son, Britannicus. At 15, Nero married Claudius's daughter, Octavia. That made him not only the heir, but also the emperor's son-in-law. But Agrippina was not patient. In October of 54 AD, Emperor Claudius sat down for dinner and never got up again. The official reason was that he had a stomach problem caused by eating mushrooms. But people in Rome knew what really happened. Agrippina had waited long enough and decided to poison him. She gave him his favourite dish, mushrooms, with poison in it. Some stories say that when the first dose did not work quickly, she called a woman named Locusta, a known poison expert. Locusta finished the job using a feather dipped in poison, pushed into his throat while pretending to help him vomit. Claudius died in pain, shaking and screaming as the poison burned inside his body. At just 17 years old, Nero became ruler of almost the entire known world. At first, things looked good. His early actions made him seem kind and wise. When asked to approve someone's execution, a daily job for Roman emperors, he famously said, "I wish I never learned how to write." He lowered taxes, gave gifts to the public, and promised to follow the good example of Emperor Augustus. But people close to him noticed something was wrong. His teacher Seneca later wrote that it felt like trying to teach Caligula all over again, something that turned out to be true. While Nero spoke kindly in public, he was already planning his first murder in secret. His target was his stepbrother Britannicus, the real son of Claudius, and someone who could take the throne. Britannicus was only 14, quiet, and had never shown interest in ruling. But in Nero's paranoid mind, just being alive made him dangerous. Nero planned the killing carefully. It happened at a dinner party in the palace, in front of Rome's most important people. Britannicus asked for his wine to be cooled with water, a normal request, but the water had poison in it, placed there by the same woman, Locusta, who helped kill Claudius. As everyone at the party watched, Britannicus drank the wine and started shaking. His face turned blue, his eyes rolled back, and he fell to the ground. His body jerked violently as the poison took over. While this happened, Nero kept eating calmly. When guests looked shocked, he told them it was just one of Britannicus's usual seizures. The boy had suffered from them before. Britannicus died in minutes. Foam came from his mouth and his body twisted in pain. Nero told the servants to take the body away and keep the dinner going. When someone said they should call a doctor, Nero coldly said, "No need, he always has these fits." But this was just the start. Nero was only beginning to enjoy killing. For the first few years of his rule, Nero was kept in control by three powerful people: his mother Agrippina, his tutor Seneca, and Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard. People later called these three the good influences because they stopped Nero from doing worse things. Under their watch, the empire had a few peaceful and successful years, which later became known as the 5 good years of Nero. But Agrippina had not worked so hard to put her son on the throne just to see others control him. She had already tasted the power of being the emperor's mother, and she was not ready to give it up. She started demanding more power. She wanted to be included in all government decisions. She wanted to sit next to Nero at public events. She even said her face should be printed on Roman coins next to her son's. Nero started to feel trapped by his mother's control. The young emperor wanted to enjoy all the pleasures that came with power, but he did not want any of the hard work or duties. He wanted to race chariots, act on stage, and sleep with anyone he liked, things his mother believed were shameful for someone who ruled Rome. The final turning point came when Nero fell in love with a woman named Poppaea Sabina. She was the wife of his friend Marcus Salvius Otho. Poppaea was the opposite of Agrippina, young, attractive, seductive, and without any morals. She slowly began turning Nero against his mother. She told him that as long as Agrippina controlled him, he was not really emperor, that he was just a puppet doing his mother's bidding. Agrippina noticed this danger and reacted the only way she could. She started openly supporting Britannicus instead, Claudius's real son, hinting that maybe she had picked the wrong boy to be emperor. It was a fatal mistake. Nero made up his mind his mother had to die. But killing Agrippina was not going to be easy. She was loved by the public, respected by the army, and had her own guards protecting her. On top of that, she had already lived through many assassination attempts, and had become very careful, using food tasters and people who specialized in poison cures. Nero needed a plan that would make her death look like an accident. His first plan was both clever and deadly. He ordered a special boat to be built just for her, one with a secret roof that would collapse and crush everyone inside. It would look like a tragic accident at sea. The plan was simple: invite Agrippina to a festival in Baiae, then put her on the boat for the return trip. Once they were far from land, the trap would be triggered. On the night of the festival, March 23rd, 59 AD, Agrippina was in a good mood. She thought her son was finally treating her the way she deserved. She believed he saw her as the royal mother she always wanted to be. She got on the boat with her friend Axaronia and a few servants, not knowing she had just stepped into a trap meant to kill her. Once the boat reached deeper water, the collapsing roof mechanism was set off. The heavy lead-covered roof crashed down with a loud bang. But the plan failed badly. Instead of killing Agrippina, the falling roof crushed Acheronia instead. Agrippina's strong instincts kicked in. She had survived the crazy rule of Caligula, the dangers of Claudius, and now her own son's betrayal. She quickly jumped into the sea. She was a skilled swimmer, and that ability saved her life. The boat crew tried to kill her using oars and sharp hooks, but she kept swimming in the dark water. Her thick clothes pulled her down, but her strong will kept her going. She heard them shouting and cursing behind her as they searched the water, but somehow she reached the shore. Somehow this woman, who had lived through so many dangerous moments in Roman politics, pulled herself out of the sea and made it to safety. When Nero heard that his mother was still alive, he panicked. The idea that it had all been an accident was no longer believable. Agrippina now knew exactly who had tried to kill her, and she would not stay quiet. Nero only had a few hours before she gathered her allies and took action. Nero turned to Anicetus, the navy commander who had designed the deadly boat. "Finish it," Nero said. "Kill her tonight." That night, Anicetus and a group of soldiers surrounded Agrippina's villa while she was trying to gather her supporters. They found her in her room, still soaked from the sea, trying to send messages to her friends. When she saw the armed men burst into her room, she knew her end had come. But Agrippina faced death the same way she lived, with pride and strength. She stood tall, looked directly at the men sent to kill her, and gave her final words. "Strike my womb first, stab the place that gave birth to such a monster." The soldiers paused for a second. This was not just any woman. They were standing in front of the daughter of Germanicus, the sister of a Roman emperor, and the mother of the current ruler. But orders were orders. The swords came down again and again, cutting through skin and bone until Agrippina the Younger, once the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire, was dead, lying in her own blood. When Nero got the message that his mother was dead, he did not feel sadness or guilt. He felt relief. The woman who helped make him emperor, and then tried to control him, was finally gone. Now he could rule completely on his own. But killing his mother would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Roman people might have looked the other way if he had killed a political rival. But killing your own mother broke the deepest rules of family and religion. Gossip spread quickly all over Rome. People said Nero not only killed his mother, but even walked into her bedroom after she died, looked over her naked body, and made comments about which parts were attractive and which were not. Whether this story was true or not, it showed who Nero was becoming. He had crossed a line that could not be crossed back. This one act turned him from a cruel young man into something truly monstrous. And worse things were coming. Now that Agrippina was dead and his other advisors were losing power, Nero was free to do whatever he wanted. He started chasing pleasure with the same passion he once used for murder. He raced chariots in private tracks. He acted on stage for specially picked audiences. He had sexual affairs that even shocked the most spoiled nobles in Rome. His marriage to Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, was never about love. She was quiet, respectful, and stood for the old Roman values that Nero found boring. He was more interested in Poppaea Sabina, who finally convinced her husband Otho to divorce her so she could be with Nero. Poppaea was everything Octavia was not. She was bold, manipulative, and had no moral limits. She knew that power was the most powerful form of attraction. She used her beauty and charm to control Nero like a weapon. Under Poppaea's influence, Nero started to think of murder as something fun, not just something useful. His first target was Marcus Junius Silanus, a family member of Augustus. He had done nothing wrong, his only crime was having royal blood. Nero had him poisoned simply because he might someday become a threat. Next came Plautus, another man from the royal family, who was executed based on weak or fake reasons. But Nero's hunger for killing was growing fast. Soon even people close to him were in danger. Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard who had helped Nero during his early years, died in a way many found suspicious. The official cause was throat cancer, but most people believed he was poisoned. After Burrus died, Seneca, Nero's teacher, had no power left. He was pushed into retirement. By the year 62 AD, 5 years after becoming emperor, Nero had removed everyone who could have stopped him. Now no one could question him. He was feared by all and drunk with the power to decide who would live or die across the whole empire. Then Nero decided that Octavia had to die too. She had done nothing wrong except not having children and standing in the way of Nero's obsession with Poppaea. But to Nero that was enough reason. The problem was that Octavia was very popular. People loved her because she reminded them of the kind and fair Claudius. She also stood for the old Roman values. First, Nero tried to divorce her, saying their marriage was illegal because they were too closely related. But the people did not accept that. So next, he accused Octavia of cheating with several men, even slaves. These men were tortured until they said whatever Nero's guards wanted to hear. Their screams could be heard echoing through the halls of the palace prison. Still, the Roman public did not believe it. When Nero announced that he was going to marry Poppaea, people lost their minds. Riots broke out across the city. Angry crowds surrounded the palace and demanded that Octavia be brought back as empress. They pulled down Poppaea's statues and dragged them through the streets. Meanwhile, they placed flowers on pictures of Octavia to honour her. For a short time, Nero hesitated. The riots reminded Nero that no matter how powerful he was, he still needed the support of the people. For a short time, he allowed Octavia to return to the palace. Meanwhile, Poppaea was quietly sent to stay at a villa outside the city. But Poppaea was not someone who accepted failure easily. She knew her whole future depended on becoming empress, and she was willing to do anything to make it happen. She convinced Nero that the riots were part of a bigger plot, that Octavia was secretly working against him, and that only killing her would guarantee his safety. Nero did not need much convincing. He had Octavia arrested, accusing her of treason and cheating, and sent her to the island of Pandateria, the same place where her grandmother Julia had been sent into exile years before. But sending her away was not enough for Nero. His fear and paranoia were growing. Just a few days later, he ordered her to be killed. Octavia was just 20 years old when the soldiers came for her. She had spent her whole life being used in political power games. She was married off as a child to help with political deals, then later thrown aside and brought back again based on what her stepbrother husband wanted. Now, as she faced death, she showed more strength than ever before. The soldiers tied her hands and cut her veins. Her blood slowly ran across the floor of her prison cell. It was considered a merciful death. No public execution, no chopping off of limbs, just a slow and silent end as her life faded away. With her final breath, she called out the names of her father, Claudius, and her stepbrother Britannicus, who had also been murdered. Her last words were a prayer, asking their spirits to welcome her wherever she was going. Her head was cut off and brought back to Rome to prove she was truly dead. The severed head was given to Poppaea like a twisted wedding gift. The woman who had always wanted to be empress looked at Octavia's head and smiled, happy to see her rival gone. 12 days later, Nero and Poppaea were married in a grand ceremony. The wedding cost more money than many provinces earned in a year. The palace was decorated with gold and jewels. Wine flowed like water, and Nero even performed a special song he had written himself for the event. Rome now had a new empress, one who had reached the throne by stepping over the bodies of anyone in her way. But even as Nero enjoyed his marriage, something darker was rising inside him. Simple murder no longer gave him enough thrill. He wanted more. He wanted something big, something dramatic, something that would be remembered forever. Soon, it was not a person that would die, but a city. The Great Fire of Rome started on the night of July the 18th, 64 AD. It began in the shops near the Circus Maximus. No one knows exactly how it started. Maybe someone dropped an oil lamp, or maybe it was a cooking fire left burning. But the summer had been very dry. The wooden buildings were like matchsticks, and the wind was strong. What started as a small fire quickly turned into a giant blaze that destroyed nearly 3/4 of the entire city. For 6 days and 7 nights, flames tore through Rome's crowded neighbourhoods. Fire jumped from one building to the next faster than people could run. The narrow streets turned into deadly traps, filled with fire, smoke, and falling wood. The lucky people escaped to the open Campus Martius or hid in the private gardens of the rich. They watched from a distance as their homes were destroyed. The unlucky ones were caught in the fire. Many burned to death, their screams drowned out by the sound of the flames. Ancient historians do not agree on where Nero was when the fire started. Some say he was in Antium, the town where he was born, and that he rushed back as soon as he heard the news. Others say he was already in Rome and helped organize rescue efforts, even letting refugees stay in his palace. But the most famous and most damaging story came from the historian Tacitus. According to him, Nero saw the burning city as a chance. According to this version of the story, while the flames destroyed the city, Nero climbed up to a high tower and started to sing. He chose the Iliad, a famous poem by Homer about the fall of Troy. He performed the song with all the dramatic energy he usually brought to the stage. While people were running for their lives, while children were dying in burning homes, while over 1,000 years of Roman history turned into smoke, the emperor treated the worst disaster in the city's history as a chance to perform. We do not know for sure if this story is completely true, but it tells us something very real about Nero's personality. He was completely disconnected from normal human feelings. He was so obsessed with his own artistic image that he could find beauty in horror. The burning of Rome was not a tragedy to him. It was a show, something he could enjoy. When the fire finally stopped, the destruction was massive. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 were left untouched. The rest was turned to ash and ruins. It looked like the surface of the moon, miles of destroyed buildings. Hundreds of thousands of people were now homeless, their homes, their belongings, their way of life gone. The number of dead was in the thousands. Many were burned so badly they could not even be identified. Their bodies filled the air with a terrible smell that hung over the ruined city like a dark cloud. But to Nero, the fire was not a tragedy. It was a chance. Even before the ashes cooled, Nero was walking through the wreckage with his architects, planning a new Rome. He dreamed of building something bigger and better than anything the world had ever seen. He called this dream the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This was going to be his greatest creation. It would be more than just a palace. It would take up 1/3 of the entire city. Just imagine how big that is, from Palatine Hill to the Esquiline, covering over 300 acres of the most valuable land in Rome. The main dining room was round and constantly turned in circles, day and night, like the stars in the sky. The walls were decorated with gold and precious stones. The ceilings were made with ivory and mother of pearl, which caught the sunlight and looked like stars sparkling. Fake lakes were dug out where people's homes used to be. And at the very centre of it all, a giant bronze statue of Nero stood 20 feet tall, his face turned toward the sun, as if he was a god. But the worst part was not how big or expensive the palace was. The most shocking thing was how quickly it started being built. People were still pulling bodies out of the destroyed buildings when Nero's workers came and started tearing everything down to make space for his dream palace. Families who had lost everything watched in shock as their ruined neighbourhoods were turned into gardens and fountains for the emperor's pleasure. People began to talk. They said the fire could not have been an accident. They remembered how fast Nero moved to take over the burned land. They noticed how excited he was to start building his huge palace. The rumours spread fast through the refugee camps. People began to believe that Nero had started the fire himself, that he let Rome burn because he wanted to rebuild it the way he wanted. Nero heard these rumours and realised he needed someone else to blame. His answer was cruel but smart. He decided to blame the Christians. This new religious group had come from the eastern parts of the empire. They were not Roman. They worshipped a man who had been crucified as their god. They often spoke about the world ending in fire. Most Romans thought their beliefs were strange and dangerous. That made them the perfect group to blame. What followed was not just a punishment. It was like a show designed to entertain. Nero did not just kill the Christians, he turned their deaths into public theatre. In his private gardens, he had them covered in oil and set on fire. They were used as human torches to light up his evening parties. While they screamed in pain, Nero read poetry. Their burning bodies made shadows on the faces of the guests at his parties. Others were sewn into the skins of wild animals and thrown to hunting dogs. The crowds laughed and cheered as they were torn apart. Some Christians were nailed to crosses in dramatic ways, sometimes dressed up as characters from myths to make their deaths look more like a show. Nero himself often directed these killings like they were theatre plays. He would position the victims carefully to make the scene more striking, adjust the lighting, and comment on their suffering as if he were reviewing a performance. But even as Nero used Christians as human torches or props for entertainment, his desire for destruction was growing. He was turning into something far worse than just a cruel man. He was entering the world of madness. It was during this time that Nero committed what many believed to be his most shocking act, killing his pregnant wife, Poppaea. By 65 AD, Poppaea was pregnant with Nero's second child, a daughter they would name Claudia Augusta. For a little while, it looked like becoming a father might soften Nero's heart. He treated Poppaea kindly during her pregnancy, showering her with love and expensive gifts. When the baby was born, he announced public holidays and threw celebrations across the empire. But the happiness did not last. Claudia Augusta died just 4 months later from illness. The loss pushed Nero into a fit of anger and grief that ended with Poppaea's death. Different ancient writers tell different versions of how she died, but they all agree on one thing: she was pregnant again at the time, and Nero caused her death. The historian Suetonius gave the most awful version. He said that Nero and Poppaea got into a huge argument about his obsession with chariot racing. Imagine the scene: Poppaea, heavily pregnant, standing up to her husband, perhaps tired of being second place to his horses and games. Maybe she had finally realized that the man she once controlled was now out of control. The fight got louder. Nero screamed. Then he lost his temper and kicked her hard in the stomach. She screamed in pain and fell to the ground, holding her belly as blood began to run down her legs. She tried to speak, but the pain took over. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor, her baby dying inside her. And Nero? He just stood there. He looked down at her, not with sadness, not with regret, but with frustration, like she had simply annoyed him. Then he called his slaves to clean up the scene and walked away to focus on planning his next chariot race. But Poppaea's death left an empty space in Nero's life. She was not just his wife, she had been his partner in crime, the only person who'd truly understood his dark desires. Without her, Nero felt lost. He didn't know how to fill the hole she left behind. That is when he noticed a boy named Sporus. Sporus was maybe 13 or 14 years old. He was a slave in the emperor's household. What made him stand out was how much he looked like Poppaea. He had the same soft features, the same golden hair, and the same graceful movements that had first attracted Nero to his wife. And in Nero's twisted mind, a plan began to form. A plan so strange and disgusting that even the most spoiled nobles of Rome were shocked by it. Nero ordered Sporus to be brought to him in private. The boy probably had no idea what was going on. He might have thought he was going to be given a simple job or maybe sold to someone else. Instead, Nero calmly told him that he would be castrated. The surgery was done by Nero's own doctors, men who were supposed to heal people but dared not disobey their emperor. They held the screaming boy down while a hot knife cut away his manhood. His cries echoed through the palace as Nero watched, pleased. The emperor wanted to make sure Sporus would never grow into a man. He wanted the boy trapped in a woman's body, because it reminded him of the wife he had killed. But this awful act was only the beginning of Sporus's nightmare. As the boy tried to heal, Nero had him dressed in women's clothes. His hair was styled like an empress's, and makeup was added to make him look even more like Poppaea. Teachers were brought in to train him how to walk, speak, and behave like a Roman lady. When Nero was satisfied with the transformation, he announced that he would marry Sporus in a real wedding. The ceremony was a twisted version of Roman tradition. Sporus wore a bride's dress and veil. His perfume and jewellery covered the scars left from the surgery. Nero gave him a dowry, signed wedding papers, and performed all the usual wedding rituals. The nobles stood by in silence, too scared to speak out. No one dared tell the emperor that what he was doing was wrong. After the wedding, Nero made everyone call Sporus his wife. He had a special carriage built so they could appear in public together. The people of Rome stared in shock as their ruler paraded through the streets with his bride. But Nero's abuse of Sporus was not just public. Behind closed doors, the boy was forced to take part in sick fantasies. He was made to act like Poppaea, to play out Nero's twisted desires again and again. The things he endured were horrifying, even by the standards of ancient Rome, where slaves were often treated terribly. Sporus was trapped in a body that was no longer his own, made into something that existed only to please the emperor. He had no friends, no protectors, and no way to escape. His only choices were to obey or die a worse death. While Sporus suffered in silence, Nero's cruelty spread beyond the palace. Now the emperor had developed a taste for making important Roman nobles do humiliating things. He forced senators and rich men to fight in arenas like gladiators or act on stage like entertainers. These were men who had once been powerful, now reduced to toys for Nero's pleasure. Some refused. Marcus Junius killed himself rather than obey Nero's commands. So did Lucius Seneca, the man who had once been Nero's teacher. Seneca calmly opened his veins in a bath and spoke his final words to a writer as he bled out. But for every man who chose death, many more gave in. They were too afraid to say no. Nero became known for his wild nights in the city. Wearing simple clothes as a disguise, he and a gang of rich young men would walk through the streets hurting people for fun. They would beat up shop owners, hurt women, rob travellers, and even kill people just because they felt like it. And if any victim fought back, they would be arrested the next day and charged with attacking the emperor. But maybe Nero's most shocking idea was a party that lasted all night, from sunset to sunrise. These were no normal parties. They were filled with food, wine, and the worst kinds of behaviour. Guests were encouraged to give in to every kind of sin. There were sex shows, torture displays, and even live killings done for fun. Wealthy Romans who wanted to stay on Nero's good side were forced to attend and bring their wives and daughters, knowing they might be part of the evening's sick entertainment. Nero often joined in himself. He would sing while naked slaves were whipped or tortured, or play music while prisoners were thrown to animals. He believed that real suffering made music more beautiful. He said pain made the performance more real. As these horrible stories spread through Rome and beyond, people who had once supported Nero began to turn against him, even those who had once believed in his leadership. Roman soldiers stationed far from the capital began hearing troubling stories about their emperor's behaviour. Governors in the outer provinces, who once sent flattering letters to Nero, now started pulling away from his rule. Even the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal protectors, began to complain about the man they had sworn to serve, but Nero had no idea that people were turning against him. So full of himself and blinded by power, he truly believed that everyone loved him just as much as he loved himself. When he heard that people in the provinces were criticising him, he brushed it off as jealousy. He thought they simply could not understand his artistic greatness. In this strange, overconfident state of mind, Nero decided to do something huge, take a trip to Greece and prove to the world that he was the best performer in history. He would sing, act, play music, and even race chariots in every major festival. He was sure he would win everything. His trip to Greece in 667 AD turned into a year-long show of ego and corruption. Nero entered every event, singing, music, acting, chariot racing, and won them all. It was obvious to everyone that the results were fake. The judges, terrified of offending the emperor, suddenly discovered that Nero was the greatest performer they had ever seen. One event became especially famous. During a chariot race at the Olympics, Nero fell off and could not finish the race. Still, the judges declared him the winner. They said his effort was so noble that he deserved first place anyway. By the end of the trip, Nero had won over 800 first-place awards, more than anyone in history. When he returned to Rome, he paraded through the streets in the same chariot that Augustus had once used to celebrate military victories, but instead of celebrating real wars and conquests, Nero bragged about beating singers and actors, as if that made him a hero. The people of Rome watched in shock and shame. Their emperor, who was supposed to run the empire, had wasted an entire year playing dress-up on foreign stages. Worse, he had emptied the empire's treasury to fund his long trip. To make up for the money he spent, he raised taxes on people who were already struggling. But a far bigger problem was building in the provinces. Powerful leaders and army generals began to wonder if Rome could survive with Nero in charge. In Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex started a rebellion and declared that the empire needed a new leader. In Spain, another governor named Galba began raising an army. Even the normally quiet provinces in Africa began showing signs of unrest. News of these revolts reached Nero while he was still celebrating his so-called victories in Greece. Instead of worrying, he became excited. He thought the rebellions would give him a chance to create more drama, more theatrical scenes where he could show off his power and creativity. He imagined punishing the rebels in the most dramatic ways possible, writing songs about it and designing costumes for when he returned in triumph. To Nero, the uprisings were not dangerous, they were a stage, and he was still the star of the show. But when more reports arrived, even Nero began to realize the truth. Things were falling apart quickly. The rebellion was spreading fast. Galba was now marching toward Rome with a trained army. For the first time in his life, Nero faced a real military threat from a serious general who had nothing to lose. And Nero's reaction showed just how out of touch he had become. Instead of preparing his army or trying to make peace, he started planning another performance tour, this time in Egypt. He believed the people there would understand and admire his talents more than the people of Rome. He even sent letters to governors saying he was busy with important artistic projects and would deal with the rebellion later, when he had time. But back in Rome, things were getting worse very quickly. The Praetorian Guard, realizing Nero's time was up, started secretly communicating with Galba's men. Senators, who had kept quiet for years out of fear, began holding private meetings about replacing Nero. Even the everyday people, once entertained by his wild shows, were starting to grow tired of him. Like with many dictators, the end came fast and unexpectedly. On June 8th, 68 AD, Nero woke up to learn that the Praetorian Guard had left him during the night. The Senate had declared him a public enemy and sentenced him to death by whipping, a punishment so humiliating it was usually given only to the lowest of criminals. For the first time ever, Nero was completely alone. His guards were gone. His supporters had disappeared. Even his slaves were sneaking out of the palace in the dark. The man who had ruled through fear now saw that fear was a weak foundation for power. In his last moments, Nero did not act like a brave leader. There were no grand speeches, no bold decisions, just tears, panic, and self-pity. He walked through his empty palace crying, yelling, and begging for Sporus to stay with him. Sporus, still dressed like a woman, still pretending to be empress, was probably the only person in Rome who had no choice but to remain by his side. When Nero heard that Galba's army was closing in, he finally understood it was over. But even then, he could not face it with strength. He did not try to fight back or surrender. Instead, he decided to run. He thought maybe he could escape to the Parthians, Rome's longtime enemies, and beg for their help. His plan was foolish and desperate. He would sneak out of the city at night, head to the coast, and sail to the east. There, he believed, the Parthian king would welcome him as a fellow artist and treat him like royalty. In his imagination, Nero saw himself living in luxury and performing for fans in a faraway land while Rome forgot him. But when he tried to find people to help him escape, he discovered the truth. His reign of fear had left him with no real friends. Old allies refused to meet him. Loyal servants pretended to be sick. Even his musicians, paid to praise him, would not go with him. The emperor, who had once been surrounded by praise, now stood completely alone. His false followers had vanished the moment danger arrived. As the sun started to rise and Galba's army came closer, Nero made one last attempt to hide. He decided to flee to the home of his freed slave Phaon, about 4 miles outside the city. He hoped he could hide there and figure out what to do next. It was a sad, humiliating end for a man who once commanded armies. Now he was sneaking out of his capital like a common thief, begging for safety from a man he had once owned. The journey to Phaon's house was miserable. Nero, who had always travelled in gold-covered carriages and shining chariots, was now walking on foot through fields and olive groves in the early morning dark. He avoided the main roads, scared of being seen or caught. He kept his face hidden under a cloak and was only joined by 4 people: Phaon the freedman, Epaphroditus his secretary, Neophytus his servant, and Sporus, still dressed like a woman, still pretending to be Nero's wife even as their world collapsed around them. It was a strange and sad scene: a fallen emperor, 3 loyal followers, and a castrated boy dressed as a bride, wandering the countryside like a twisted joke of royal dignity. When they reached Phaon's home, Nero was so scared he refused to go through the front door. His companions had to dig a tunnel under the house just to get him inside. He crawled through the hole on his hands and knees and entered a small basement room. There, in the dark, he waited, hiding like a scared animal in the final hours of his life. The villa was small compared to what an emperor was used to. Just a few tiny rooms, plain furniture, nothing close to the luxury Nero had always known. For a man who had lived in gold-covered palaces, eaten from silver dishes, and sipped wine from jewel-studded cups, the plainness of Phaon's home must have felt like another world entirely. But this was where the most powerful man on earth would spend his final moments. In that cramped basement, as the first light of June 9th crept through the dirty windows, Nero finally faced the truth he had spent his whole life running from. He was completely and totally alone. The few followers who had come with him now sat quietly in the corners, They were no longer the flattering courtiers who once hung on his every word, but scared men wondering if staying with a fallen emperor would get them killed. Sporus sat silently in his woman's clothes. The makeup on his face had been smeared by tears, perhaps not for Nero, but for himself, unsure what future lay ahead in a world that had no place for what the emperor had turned him into. As time passed, messengers started arriving with worse and worse news. Galba's troops were already inside Rome. The Senate had not only confirmed Nero's death sentence, but had ordered him to be dragged naked through the streets, beaten with rods until he died, and thrown into the Tiber River like a common criminal. The Praetorian Guard was now hunting him down, hoping to bring his head to Galba as a gift and prove their loyalty to the new ruler. But the worst blow came with the final message from the palace. Nero's servants were looting his personal rooms. They were taking golden statues, priceless art, and even his stage costumes. The same slaves who used to shake at the sound of his steps were now fighting each other over his belongings, like wild animals tearing apart a corpse. When Nero heard this, something inside him snapped. The man who had once demanded worship from millions, who made senators bow before his golden image, who thought of himself as a god on earth, fell to his knees on the dirt floor of a freed slave's basement and began to cry like a helpless child. "They're stealing from me," he sobbed, his voice shaking with weakness, the same kind he used to mock in others. "My beautiful things, my costumes, my lyres." The man who had killed his own mother, wives, rivals, and countless innocents, was now crying over losing his props and outfits. He could not grasp that his downfall meant more than just losing pretty possessions. As the morning continued, the sound of horses came from a distance. Search teams were closing in, getting closer to Phaon's villa. The few people still with Nero began giving each other looks, silently wondering if they would be safer running now or staying by the emperor's side. Then Nero's secretary Epaphroditus spoke the words that forced him to finally face the end. "Caesar, you have to act. They will be here soon, and what they do to you will be worse than anything you've done to others. Remember Marcus Crassus, how the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat? Think of every cruel death you've ordered. They will not be kind to you." The reminder worked. Nero's crying turned into fear. He began to panic as he pictured himself suffering the same pain he had caused others. He thought of the Christians he had burned alive, their screams echoing in the night. He saw Octavia's blood spreading across the floor. He remembered Agrippina's final expression as swords cut into her. For the first time, Nero, the monster, understood what it felt like to be hunted. "I cannot die like this," he whispered. His voice was so quiet it was almost lost in the air. "Not like a criminal, not dragged through the streets for people to laugh at. I am Caesar. I come from the great Augustus. I am a poet, a performer, an artist. I brought beauty to this world." Even now, even in his final hour, Nero's ego would not let go. He still could not see himself the way others saw him. A killer, a tyrant, a man whose death would be celebrated across the empire. In Nero's mind, he still believed he was a misunderstood genius, someone who was being punished by people too foolish to understand his greatness. Phaon, who had known him for many years and understood how his mind worked, gently knelt beside the fallen emperor and spoke in a calm voice. "Then die the way a Caesar should die. Choose your own ending. Show the world that you still have the courage of your ancestors." The idea of suicide had been hanging in the air ever since they arrived at the villa, but no one had dared say it until now. In Roman culture, ending your life by your own hand was seen as more honourable than letting your enemies kill you. A man who chose the moment of his death kept some dignity, no matter what he had done in life. But Nero had never shown physical bravery. Every time he wanted someone dead, he had others do it for him. His murders were done with poison, lies, or hired killers. The thought of stabbing himself, feeling a blade enter his own skin, made him feel sick. "I cannot," he said, his voice rising like a child's. "You do not understand. These hands, they are the hands of an artist. They are meant to create beauty, not cause pain. I have never hurt anyone with my own hands. I am not a soldier. I am a singer, a poet." It was shocking how deeply he believed this. This was the same man who had ordered the killing of his own mother, his wives, his advisors, and he was now claiming he had never hurt anyone. He could not even see the difference between ordering death and doing it himself. It showed how far removed Nero's view of himself was from reality. Neophytus, his servant, tried a different way to reach him. "Caesar, remember your stage performances. Think of this as your final role, a true Roman choosing death over shame. People will remember how you left the stage. Make it count." For a second, Nero's eyes lit up. The idea of turning his death into a final performance seemed to excite him. He began walking in circles around the room, waving his arms dramatically, imagining how the scene should go. "Yes," he said with growing energy. "Yes, this could be glorious. A noble death, full of dignity and emotion. They will sing about it. Writers will praise my bravery. History will tell of how Nero chose death over defeat." But while he rehearsed his dramatic end, the sound of galloping horses was getting louder. The soldiers were closing in, and there was almost no time left. His companions urged him to act, but Nero could not move. His fantasy of a perfect death was fading in the face of reality. Just then, a messenger rushed in with the worst news yet. Nero's location had been discovered. The soldiers were only minutes away. Outside, the sun caught their metal armor as they rode hard toward the villa. This was it. The time had come, and Nero finally realized that all the speeches, all the planning meant nothing if he did not have the courage to follow through. His hand shaking, he picked up the dagger that Epaphroditus had placed in front of him. He held it like it was something dangerous, afraid that just touching it would hurt him. "I cannot do this alone," he whispered. "Someone must help me. Someone has to guide the blade." Even now, even at the very end, Nero refused to take full responsibility. He wanted someone else to do the hard part, just like always. Epaphroditus stepped forward, his face heavy with sorrow. "If you are sure, Caesar, I will help you. But you must start. You have to show us that this is your choice." Nero nodded slowly, tears pouring down his cheeks. He placed the sharp tip of the dagger against his throat, but his hand was shaking so much he could barely keep the knife in place. For several long seconds, Nero stood frozen, unable to gather the courage to push the blade in. Outside, the sound of horses had stopped. Voices echoed. Soldiers were calling to one another as they surrounded the villa. Heavy boots thudded on the ground above them, and the scraping of armor rang out in the room above where they hid. "Now," Epaphroditus whispered urgently. "It must be now, or they will take you alive." With a sudden jerk, Nero shoved the dagger into his neck, but he missed. His hand was weak, and the blade went in at the wrong angle. It slipped into muscle, not into the arteries. Blood spilled, but not enough to kill him quickly, only enough to cause sharp, horrible pain. He collapsed to the ground, the dagger still stuck in his throat. His mouth filled with blood, and he made choking, wet sounds. He tried to speak, but only spit. Blood and unclear noises came out. Epaphroditus, seeing that Nero had failed and would suffer a slow death, grabbed the knife and pushed it in deeper. This time the blade hit the right spot. Blood poured from Nero's neck, spreading in a dark pool around his head. His life was leaving him, but even in his final moments, Nero was still thinking about himself. With his last breath, he whispered the words that would become his final quote. "Qualis artifex pereo." What an artist dies in me. Those last words showed how truly lost Nero was in his own fantasy. Even as he lay dying on a dirty basement floor, alone, betrayed and hunted, he still thought of himself as a great man. He did not see himself as a cruel ruler who had brought this on himself, but as a misunderstood genius, a loss to the world. The sad truth was this: Nero had never created anything beautiful. His only art had been torture, murder, and sick displays for his own amusement. But with his dying breath, he still claimed to be an artist. He could not understand that the world did not mourn him. It was finally free from him. As Nero's eyes turned glassy and his chest stopped rising, a loud crash came from upstairs. The soldiers had broken the door and were now searching the house. In just a few minutes, they would find the tunnel and discover Nero's body. Sporus, still wearing the dress and makeup that Nero had forced on him, knelt beside the dead emperor, the same man who had stolen his life and turned him into a symbol of everything twisted about Nero's rule. No one knows what Sporus felt in that moment. Was it relief, fear, or maybe nothing at all after years of pain? The soldiers arrived moments later. Their torches lit up the grim scene, Nero's lifeless body in a pool of blood, his terrified companions standing nearby, and the young castrated boy he had once called his wife kneeling in silence. The difference between Nero's royal image and the ugly truth could not have been more obvious. When the news reached Rome, there was no mourning, only joy. People ran into the streets cheering, dancing, and placing flowers on statues of those Nero had killed. They tore down every image of the emperor they could find. After 14 years of fear and silence, they were finally free to show how much they had hated him. But maybe the clearest sign of what Nero had meant to the world came from the rest of the empire. Across the Roman lands, from Britain to Egypt, Spain to Syria, people celebrated. Festivals broke out without any planning, as ordinary citizens rejoiced that the monster was gone. No emperor's death had ever brought such joy. The Roman Senate moved fast to erase Nero from history. They ordered his name scratched off all buildings, his statues melted down, and his face removed from coins. They wanted to erase every sign that he had ever lived, to act like the Roman Empire had never been ruled by someone like him. But no amount of censorship could wipe away the memory of Nero's actions, or the lessons his rule left behind about the dangers of unlimited power. His crimes were too many, too horrifying, and too well documented to simply vanish from history. His grand palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, which he built on top of the burned ruins of Rome, was slowly destroyed by the emperors who came after him. They filled in its huge rooms with concrete and built public baths and theatres over it. Where Nero had once dreamed of showcasing his genius, the Colosseum would rise instead, a monument for the people, not for one man's ego. Sporus, the young castrated boy who'd been forced to pretend to be Nero's wife, had a future full of uncertainty. Some say he was protected for a short time by Otho, who briefly became emperor after Galba. But after that, history loses track of him. Maybe he finally faded into the massive hidden world of Roman life, at last free from the nightmare Nero forced on him. The historians who wrote about Nero, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, did so with disgust. They didn't try to hide how they felt about him. Still, even they seemed to struggle to explain just how evil Nero had been, like words weren't strong enough to describe the kind of person he became. Tacitus said Nero left no sin uncommitted. Suetonius wrote about his crimes like a lawyer building a case, carefully listing each one. These writers knew they were telling more than just the story of a fallen emperor. They were telling how even a great civilization could fall apart when one person held too much power. Nero's legacy went far beyond what he personally did. His death also ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the ruling family that had led Rome since Augustus. What came next was chaos, the year of the four emperors, where Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian each took the throne one after the other. This time of confusion showed what could happen when Rome's leadership fell apart. But more importantly, Nero's rule was a warning. Rome's government had once been built to stop any one man from gaining too much control. Over time, that system had turned into one where one person's wishes could affect millions. Nero's reign showed what that could lead to, a world where the most powerful person was also the most corrupt. The comparison to modern dictators is clear and disturbing. Like Nero, many leaders in history have believed they were brilliant while doing terrible things. They convinced themselves their actions were right because of their so-called greatness, and surrounded themselves with people who only told them what they wanted to hear. The emperor who demanded to be treated like a god died alone in a basement. The man who ruled through fear learned that fear does not last forever. The artist who claimed he made beauty for the ages left behind only horror and destruction. And worst of all, Nero never seemed to understand any of it. Even in his last moment, he believed he was a misunderstood genius, not a monster who finally faced justice. His refusal to see the truth about himself made his fall complete. Nero's death is one of the clearest examples in history of poetic justice. The man who built his life on violence and cruelty ended up dying in fear and agony. The emperor who forced others to entertain him tried to end his life with a dramatic act. But no one was fooled. The man who once demanded to be worshipped like a god died alone and forgotten, like a common criminal. In the end, Nero's rule reminds us that no matter how powerful someone becomes, that power never lasts forever. Cruelty and fear might bring control for a while, but they always lead to downfall. History has a way of making sure justice is done, even to those who believe they are untouchable. Nero, the last emperor from the Julio-Claudian family, had once promised to lead with kindness and wisdom, but he gave Rome 14 years of murder, madness, and evil. His lonely death in a dark basement was not a tragedy. It was a relief. A monster had finally fallen, and the world could start to heal from the pain he caused. Still, the memory of Nero remains, a warning of how dangerous it is to give one person too much power. His blood may have soaked into the ground that day, but the damage he did will always echo through time, showing us what happens when evil goes unchecked. He did not die as an artist. He died as a coward, in silence, after silencing so many others. If you genuinely enjoyed this video and want to see more true stories, make sure to like, subscribe to our channel Nailed History, and tell me in the comments, if you were alive during Nero's reign, would you have dared to stand against him?